Welcome back. Now, the unemployment rate ticked up slightly, up by 0.2 percentage points in the fourth quarter. We put that into perspective. That's 22,000 more people unemployed, typically during the holiday season. Nthabiseng Moleko, who's development economist from the Stellenbosch Business School, joins us with her analysis of the print and what it suggests for the labour market moving forward. Dr. Nthabiseng, always a pleasure. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me, and a very good afternoon.
All right, Dr. Nthabiseng, I think the presentation said after 8 consecutive increases, we are seeing a decrease here in employment or an increase in unemployment, whichever way you choose to look at it. Either way, we're going in the wrong direction.
So I think that we definitely have a systemic crisis in terms of the country's unemployment rate. What you can see is that no considerable changes are actually occurring in terms of the labor absorption rate, which is a sign and a condition of the systemic crisis. But also you see the same type of the labor market to absorb our young people, particularly the unemployed in their masses. You also have a systemic crisis with the stagnant, I would say, and very stubborn number of what we call discouraged work. Simply put, above 3.2 million, 3.5, it ranges depending on the quarter, depending on the province. But what you find is that 6 out of the 9 provinces systemically have had what I call economic wasteland type conditions, where economic priorities, economic activities haven't yielded sufficient labor absorptive outcomes. And that simply put, not sufficient efforts have been done to increase and enhance productivity outside of the Western Cape, the Gauteng, and possibly KwaZulu-Natal, which has caught up significantly to the other 2 provinces.
Actually, I wrote that in my notes, Dr. Nthabiseng, what is happening in the Eastern Cape, in the Northwest, in Limpopo. We are still seeing this migration, into the provinces that you've just made mention of. But are we neglecting these provinces? What is specifically happening in there with those local economies that is keeping these provinces from being able to create meaningful work for even those who stay? Because, of course, a lot of people, like I'm saying, leave and go to the Western Cape and Gauteng and so on.
Thank you for that question. I think let's talk about Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, Limpopo, as you've mentioned. These provinces are largely your rural populations. These provinces also have, in the South African GDP, or if you look at the framework of the economy, have a larger proportion of people in the informal sectors. These provinces also have the history of inadequate infrastructure, but also inadequate supply in terms of capital-intensive inputs. And the public and private sector investment strike that we have seen in this country over the last 2 decades has seeped in continuously to these provinces that have not actually caught up. So the backlog has consistently caused them to be on the outskirts of economic activity. I think for me, what is important is what must be done. And what can be done in these provinces is increasing agricultural productivity, is enhancing manufacturing capabilities, and also reviving industrial parks, in reviving economic zones where they already exist. So there's a significant investment that have been made by your DTICs in the form of, in all these provinces, and either agri parks or what we call SEZ, which are the special economic zones, which are geared primarily for manufacturing. What needs to happen is linkages to the regions, to the districts that are economically not necessarily as revived as others, enhancing their linkages by ensuring that entrepreneurs, by ensuring that the rural populations, and by ensuring access to new entrants, that includes your youth, that includes your women, particularly Black women, and that includes those who are on the economic fringes. And I think deliberate efforts need to be done here. We've got to finance our development finance institutions significantly, because the current financial system and economic framework is not being supported sufficiently. And that means that institutions like the National Empowerment Fund, which have had clean audits, which you barely hear about for the last 18 years since existence, this is another state-owned enterprise that is able to disburse funding to much needed entrepreneurs. So there's a plethora of efforts that require deliberate will, intention, but also urgency, so that we can get economic actions and economic revival happening in these regions, because it is much needed.
Nthabiseng, you also make mention of the issue of, reindustrialization of sorts, manufacturing, special economic zones. And what we see from this data is that it's services industries that are actually, really employing a bulk of the people. And that also tells me that also systematically, even in the most urban areas, even in the metros, we are seeing these industries that are capable of mass employment being neglected or just not operating at their absolute optimum.
So just a correction. I think that the type of growth we've seen in South Africa has primarily been driven by what we call services-led growth. And the problem with that is that the labor or the employment intensity of the services sector is not adequate to enable the unemployed to be captured in the statistics of the employed. So we have seen over the last 2 decades, particularly post democratization, South Africa growing primarily from your tertiary services. And the big driver of this is business and financial services, and it's also government expenditure and the retail and wholesale services. Now, these 3 key sectors have been driving upwards our economic output, not on the back of productivity or intensity in our industrial capabilities. So we've seen a contraction of both your primary sector, particularly mining and agriculture, as a proportion of GDP, but also your manufacturing. Now, what this means is that services-led growth is inadequate to deal with the unemployment conundrum. I want to repeat that. Services is not necessarily negative to the economic output. It's very positive. When you look at tourism, when you look at financial services, ITC, even real estate, but do services sector create jobs? That has been a categorical not adequate in terms of the South African growth story. So what must be done? The 2 subsectors that we see, not only do they increase the rate of growth, but also they have a rapid response to the unemployment crisis. That is industry, that is industrialization, that is your manufacturing, your utilities, your construction. These are the subsectors that we need to enhance. The provinces you mentioned earlier that are seeing a downward economic trajectory are largely rural provinces. We are not talking the same vein about rural development, agrarian reform, agricultural processing of subsectors, and developing food production in all of these subsectors, irrespective of the conundrum of the global financial markets and the global economic constraints. I think African nations, particularly South Africa, have value chains and they have a very dualistic agricultural subsector. But if we focus on developing your subsistence, your low income, and your sectors that have been excluded into the mainstream of the economy, you'll start to deal with the unemployment conundrum. You'll start to deal with the low employment intensity conundrum that we are faced with, but also you'll start to see our youth proportion in terms of employment going up. You'll start to see women in the main entering the labor force, and you'll start to see the improvement in GDP because now more households have household income and they can spend this and put it into the economic activity within their regions, but it has a multiplier effect all around. So I think all of us are suffering, but I think that government has to be very deliberate about this. And I think that the same type of urgency and organizing of the economic subsectors and all the institutions of the state around this unemployment crisis is critical. There's no better time than now. And we've got the minds, we've got the ideas, we've got the strategies and so forth. We simply need to be urgent and also very deliberate about the key subsectors that need to be enhanced so that you start to see an uptick in growth, but also see an uptick in some of these provinces where I would say are economic wastelands.
We don't have much time left, Dr. Nthabiseng, but I must ask you, tomorrow Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will deliver that national budget. What does an employment, driving budget look like, even with the constraints that we have to deal with right now? It's a very difficult reality that he's presented with.
Unemployment cannot be dealt with except for you deal with the structural constraints. Unemployment cannot be dealt with except for you have a growing economy. So you have to deal with the fundamental infrastructure issues around energy availability. That's the energy constraint. But also you have to deal with the nodes and the pockets of growth hindrances. And I think what we're going to probably hear tomorrow will say nothing for unemployment, unfortunately, but we will hear a lot in terms of the management and the key movement of the expenditure of the state and how they will try and balance the balance sheet. But I don't necessarily foresee anything specifically different in terms of what they can now do in the sixth administration in the last budget speech for unemployment if they haven't done it in the prior 5 years.
Well, always a pleasure hearing from you, Dr. Nthabiseng. Thank you so much for your time. That was Nthabiseng Moleko. She's development economist from the Stellenbosch Business School.